Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments from the front line. Starting out, I'll be going over some territorial changes as recently reported by Syriac maps. Starting out here in the northern front by the Kharkiv and Luhansk borders, we see to the south of Liman Pershi, there's been a lot of fighting here. It was recently reported that the Russians were attacking the village of Sinkivka from 3 directions, from the west, north and northeast. However, this has not ended well for the Russians, as the Ukrainians launched their own counterattack and managed to actually push the Russian forces back from the position to the southwest of Liman Pershi, and they have now taken control over the forest patches here to the southwest of Sinkivka. So Sinkivka is still in Ukrainian hands, and as I mentioned, this is a very important village for the Russians to take over and for the Ukrainians to hold, as taking control over this village would essentially allow the Russian forces to start threatening the supply lines that go through the Kupiansk area and to the whole northern part of the Luhansk-Kharkiv front line by Svatovo-Kreminna. So this whole area is essentially mainly supplied by Kupiansk, and there's also supplies going through Sinkove, but Kupiansk is the main supply hub. So this whole fight over this village is very important, although it is small in scale. Then we move on to the Kuzemivka area, where the Ukrainian forces have been pushed out of Novoselivske and the Russian forces held control over the heights to the south of the village. I have earlier reported on this, but it has now been confirmed by Syriac maps. As for to the south, the Ukrainian forces were pushed back here, and the Russians have managed to gain a beachhead across the river line by Kuzemivka. This I was reported on back in the 17th of July, so 4 days ago. In comparison, this also happened, but it wasn't reported by other sources. Now it has been confirmed by Syriac maps, where there is a confirmed control over the forest patches here to the west of the river line. So the Russian forces do not only have one, they have 2 positions across the river line, and they'll most likely aim to gain full control over both of them and connect the 2 of them so that they have a wider and more stable beachhead across the river line by Kuzemivka. And this is the same river that goes all the way south towards Territorial. So this beachhead across is actually very important for the Russians to hold on to, as it would allow them to essentially push across the river line and go around the Ukrainian defenses. Moving on to the Bakhmut front, here we see that the latest reports by Syriac maps indicates that the Ukrainian forces have full control over the fortifications to the north of the village, except for a small part that goes across the road. So the southern part is still contested, and the Russians are constantly counterattacking in this area, trying to regain control of the area and push the Ukrainians away, but so far it has limited success, as they've managed to sometimes push them away, but the Ukrainians always come back and take control over their fortifications. As I've mentioned earlier, this fortification is very much to the advantage of the Ukrainian forces and very difficult for the Russian forces to get a hold of due to the height elevation changes, as well as the areas where the forest patches are located and so on. So there are many things that are advantageous to the Ukrainian forces in comparison to the Russian forces. Then to the southwest is also this road intersection that has been cut off. So there's only one quick road to Avdiivka now, between Avdiivka and Klishivka. So essentially the Russian forces are in danger of getting attacked and flanked by the Ukrainian forces if they capture the village of Avdiivka and advance to the heights to the east of Klishivka, because Klishivka itself is located in a valley, which essentially means that to the west and to the east of the village there is high grounds. So if the Ukrainians are able to capture the village of Avdiivka and take control over the heights to the east of the village, then they will have the heights to the east and to the west, which would essentially squeeze the Russians out of the village, or essentially have them shoot down on the Russian positions, which would be devastating for the Russian forces. And as I've mentioned many times now, Klishivka is the most important village in the southern flank of Bakhmut. If the Russians lose this, then they would be in trouble in the whole southern flank. Moving on to the Kamianka area north of Avdiivka, after their last failure of an offensive of the Russian forces towards this area, they have done another one where they here managed to actually capture some territory, or it could be some territory that they managed to capture through the last time, which was considered a failure, where I showed the videos of Russian vehicles essentially storming the Ukrainian positions and then getting hit by artillery and then retreating. However, it seems that these are the areas in which they were fighting. The Russian forces actually managed to reach this whole area and were fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian positions right here. So this is actually far behind where the fighting was actually happening, which could indicate that this is actually the territory they managed to capture at that time, as these are areas behind where the fighting was actually taking place. So most likely the Russian forces managed to break through Ukrainian positions, and then the infantry managed to capture these positions and hold on to them. After which we move on to the south of this area, to the north of Marinka, where the area here has been confirmed to be captured by Syriac maps in their latest update, where they also showcase here that the Russian forces managed to capture the outpost, which is filled with trenches and fortifications for the Ukrainian forces, and an area that has been under the Ukrainian control since 2014. Then we move on to the Ukrainian offensive area, and starting out by the Remevsky Ledge area, the Russian forces have actually managed to push back the Ukrainian forces in this area. The Ukrainians managed to get a foothold in Staromaiorske, which I reported on, and then since then the Russian forces have now managed to push the Ukrainian forces out and recaptured these forward positions, as well as push the Ukrainian forces back to the river line to the northwest of Staromaiorske as well. So in this whole line, the Russian forces managed to reestablish a defensive position by this area to further protect the village of Staromaiorske as well as Priotne, as they are attempting to hold this line here by the river line. So most likely, if the Russians are keen on holding the river line here, then they must also push to the north of Priotne. However, so far they've only had success by Staromaiorske. As for the Robotine area, the Ukrainian forces have here advanced, and they have managed to capture this small territory here to the southwest of their held positions. So over the past few days, where there has been essentially a daily column of Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles trying to advance, they have managed to capture this part right here, as they are attempting to further advance towards the village of Robotine and gain control of it. So they are fighting through the fortifications the Russians have prepared to the northeast of the village. And then finally, we have the changes by the village of Kamyanske here to the westernmost part of the front line. Here we saw the Ukrainian forces manage to actually capture positions to the northwest of Lubkove in the direction of the village of Kamyanske, and they actually managed to capture this whole part here. But since then, the Russian forces have counterattacked and hold on to their positions in the village of Kamyanske, the southern part, as the Russian forces are keen on holding on to this location here and fortifications as well as the proper positions here. As I've mentioned earlier, this village of Avdiivka is actually an important one, as it connects the fortifications in the western part and is a supply hub for the forward units in this area. So essentially, if the Ukrainian forces continuously push and capture the village of Avdiivka ahead of the fortifications, then they are able to use this as a supply hub for their own forces, which could be a stepping stone for further offensive operations in this part of the front line. So the Russian forces are trying to keep the Ukrainians as far away from that area as possible, as they try to hold on to their current positions and prevent the Ukrainians from advancing further, especially if they overstretch their positions, as currently they're fighting in a wider front than they were earlier. They're now fighting on this part, where the earlier were focusing on the Lubkov-Pyathatki area and continuing on to Serbianki. However, the Russian forces have managed to hold on to Serbianki, so they are now moving further northwest and trying that area instead. As for generally on the front line, both in Zaporizhzhia front but also on the Bakhmut front, the United States have started sending cluster munitions to Ukraine, and with this video here we are starting to see the first uses of these munitions, as we can see how the artillery smoke is scattered across in a circle, which manages to match up with how cluster bombs function, and they're all rising at essentially the same rate. So this is a clear indication that cluster munitions have been used, but there's no footage of the actual explosion. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.